In 1851 Prussia, a surgeon's estate hid a dark secret. Over 200 unregistered skeletons buried beneath his school of anatomy. What drove him to commit such horrors, and who were his victims? Stay with us until the end to uncover the chilling truth behind the Bone House murders. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that haunt history's darkest corners. The Bone House is waiting. Are you ready? In the quiet countryside of mid-19th century Prussia, the grand manor of Dr. Wilhelm Krantz stood solemn and imposing, nestled among dense forests and rolling fields. To the villagers who lived miles away in scattered hamlets, the estate was a place of whispered rumors and cautious distance. It was a house built not just of stone and timber, but of secrets so dark they would remain buried for decades beneath its very foundations. Wilhelm Krantz was a man of remarkable intellect and ambition. A respected surgeon in Berlin, he had retreated to his family estate claiming a noble purpose: to create a school of anatomy, a place where he could advance the scientific study of bone density, a subject still in its infancy. The medical community regarded him with a mixture of respect and unease, for while his published work showed promise, few had ever glimpsed inside the manor's shadowed halls. What happened inside those walls would forever stain the history of Prussian medicine and haunt the surrounding villages in the decades to come. It was the spring of 1895, nearly half a century after Krantz's death, when the estate changed hands. The new owners, distant relatives unfamiliar with the manor's past, planned to renovate and modernize the old house. But as workmen began clearing the basement, they stumbled upon something that would shake the foundations of the village and the nation. Behind a false wall deep within the cellar lay a secret chamber. Within that chamber were hundreds of human skeletons, stacked with chilling precision. No signs of flesh, no remnants of clothing, no documentation, no records. Just bones, femurs, skulls, ribs, vertebrae, arranged as if they were trophies in a macabre collection. Local authorities were called. Police, doctors, and forensic experts arrived, their faces pale as they realized the scale of the discovery. Over 200 skeletons in one place. None of them matched any known missing persons or cadaver registries. How could so many bodies have vanished without trace? And why had they been hidden here? The public outcry was immediate and intense. Newspapers across Prussia ran headlines filled with speculation, horror, and disbelief. Was the surgeon a murderer? A madman? Or something even worse? A scientist who had lost his way? As the investigation unfolded, so too did the dark story of Wilhelm Krantz, a man whose obsession with bone anatomy had twisted into a grotesque nightmare. His neighbors recalled strange noises at night, unexplained visits from shadowy figures, and the eerie silence that seemed to envelop the estate, as if the house itself mourned the dead it concealed. The villagers, bound by superstition and fear, refused to go near the manor. Some whispered that Krantz had made a pact with death, trading morality for forbidden knowledge. Others feared that the bones were not just remains, but a warning etched in silence. What drove a man, a surgeon sworn to heal, to turn his estate into a tomb? Who were the victims whose bodies never found a grave or a name? And how had this secret stayed buried for so long, hidden beneath the very ground where life had once flourished? This was the mystery that gripped Prussia, a tale of science corrupted, lives stolen, and the silent testimony of bones speaking from the shadows. As we begin to unravel the layers of this dark history, prepare yourself for a journey into obsession, cruelty, and the terrifying limits of human ambition. The Bone House has many stories to tell, and the first whispers start here, in its silent cellars. Wilhelm Krantz was born in 1813, in the gray-blue winter of Königsberg, where the sun cast long shadows across cobbled streets and the cold seeped into the stone. His father, a military officer turned bureaucrat, was a stern man who believed the world could be measured in obedience and order. His mother died when Wilhelm was just 8, leaving behind a silence that would follow him through every phase of his life like a second heartbeat. He was a quiet child, drawn more to insects pinned to boards and the careful lines of anatomical drawings than to play or conversation. By the age of 12, he had begun dissecting birds and rodents in the shed behind their townhouse. His tutors, hired to provide a well-rounded classical education, quickly discovered his brilliance and his distance. Wilhelm could recite entire passages from Vesalius and Boerhaave, but he could not recall the names of the other boys on his street. At 17, he entered the University of Berlin to study medicine. The city was a tangle of soot and progress, where gaslights flickered against the fog and the boundaries of science were being redrawn every year. Krantz, however, was not seduced by the bustle or politics. He spent his days in the anatomy theaters, watching the unwrapping of the human body like a sacred ritual. He spoke little, even to his professors, but wrote incessantly in notebooks filled with sketches and numbers, tracking the curvature of bones and the texture of tissue with a surgeon's precision and a collector's hunger. It was there, in the cool and blood-slicked chambers of the university hospital, that his fascination turned into something deeper, something obsessive. He did not see the human body as merely flesh and sinew. He saw it as a system of puzzles, a cathedral of structure, where each vertebra and joint sang its own mechanical truth. And he believed, with a fervor that frightened even his mentors, that bone was the key to everything. He graduated with distinction in 1836 and quickly gained reputation in Berlin's medical circles for his innovations in orthopedic surgery. By the time he was 30, he had published 2 monographs on bone density and the skeletal microstructure of tuberculosis victims. Yet, even among his admirers, there were murmurs. Krantz refused to collaborate, never lectured, and kept a lock on his surgical journals even in peer review. He seemed less interested in healing the living than in understanding the dead. Then, suddenly, in the spring of 1843, he left Berlin. No announcement, no farewell. His colleagues assumed he had taken a post abroad. In truth, he returned to the Krantz family estate, a sprawling, wooded property in the rural northeastern province of Pomerania, some 40 kilometers from the Baltic Sea. The estate had long been empty, its fields overgrown and its halls echoing with dust. Krantz arrived alone, with a cart of medical instruments, a collection of anatomical texts, and 3 iron-bound trunks that no one ever saw opened. He hired a groundskeeper and a cook from the nearby village of Ottenfeld, both of whom were given specific instructions. Meals were to be left outside his study door. No one was to enter the cellar, and any strange noises, no matter the hour, were to be ignored. The villagers whispered, of course. A man who chose to live alone in such a place was already suspicious. But Wilhelm Krantz was no ordinary recluse. He was a doctor, a man of science, educated in the capital. He paid well and kept to himself. That was enough. The first year passed quietly. The estate's windows remained dark at night, save for the flicker of candlelight in the upper study. But the groundskeeper, a stooped and rheumy-eyed man named Halbrecht, began to notice oddities. Deliveries arrived under cover of night. Crates of surgical supplies, linen-wrapped bundles, and once, a sealed barrel that sloshed thickly when moved. Visitors, never more than one at a time, came dressed in black and stayed only a few hours. They spoke little and always left looking pale. Sometimes, in the early hours before dawn, Halbrecht would hear noises from the cellar, dull thuds, the scrape of metal, once a low and rhythmic tapping like a metronome or a heartbeat. He never asked questions, but he began to sleep with a knife beneath his bed. By the winter of 1844, the estate was no longer just a residence. It had become what Krantz called in a private letter, a sanctuary of bone. No one knows exactly when the first victim disappeared, but records show that between 1845 and 1850, at least 11 itinerants and farmhands vanished within a 30-kilometer radius of the estate. The police attributed the disappearances to wolves, banditry, or drunken misadventure. No bodies were found, and the region was too rural to justify an extended investigation. But the truth was being etched in silence beneath the manor. Krantz had begun his own private research, far removed from the oversight of universities or medical boards. He believed that the density and structure of human bone could reveal not just physical health, but spiritual disposition. In one of his journals, found decades later among his papers, he wrote, "It is not the soul that survives death. It is the architecture of the self, preserved in calcium and lattice. We are not what we think. We are what remains." By 1847, he had filled 2 cellars with remains. He boiled the flesh from them himself, using cauldrons in the lower chambers of the house, then laid the bones out on polished tables for measurement and inspection. Some he arranged into full skeletons and mounted on iron stands. Others he sawed into cross-sections, storing them in oil to preserve their integrity. He catalogued each one meticulously, though never by name. Only numbers. Specimen 34, male, 40s, spinal curvature moderate. Specimen 58, female, unknown age, pelvic fractures healed. The idea that these were stolen bodies did not disturb him. They were, in his mind, sacrifices to science. The loss of identity was not a crime, but a necessity. In 1848, something changed. Perhaps the pressure of secrecy had begun to fracture his mind, or perhaps he had exhausted the supply of acquired subjects and begun seeking them out more directly. That year, a young maid from Ottenfeld, Anna Dietz, vanished on her way home from the market. She had been seen delivering fresh eggs to the Krantz estate earlier that morning. Her disappearance caused a stir in the village, more than the previous ones. She was local, known, and loved. The townspeople searched the woods and fields. They questioned Krantz, who opened his door calmly and answered their inquiries with polite surprise. "I have not seen her," he said. "Tragic, truly. These woods are treacherous. One can lose their way even in daylight." No one could prove anything. But after that day, the villagers stopped coming near the estate, even for money. Krantz dismissed his staff, claiming a desire for solitude. He said he would cook and clean for himself. Halbrecht, the groundskeeper, left without saying goodbye. The manor became a dead zone, its chimneys cold, its shutters drawn. But within, the work continued. Letters found later among his belongings reveal a deteriorating mental state. He wrote of conversations with the skeletons. He spoke of a voice that guided his hand when he dissected the hip bones of a woman he could not identify. He wrote of dreams in which he floated above fields of white bone, endless and glinting like frost. The marrow speaks, if one is quiet enough. The dead do not resent me. They only ask to be understood. He died in 1851, quietly, at his writing desk. A stroke, likely, or cardiac failure. His body was not discovered for nearly a week, until a tax official came to inquire about unpaid land fees. The cellar doors were sealed. No one dared enter. The estate was locked, its windows shuttered, and over the decades the forest began to reclaim the outer walls. Vines crawled across the stone. Birds nested in the rafters. The Bone House, as it came to be known, passed into legend. But the bones waited, stacked and silent in the dark, until someone found them. By the spring of 1895, the Krantz estate had become more ghost story than landmark. A forgotten manor swallowed by its forest, nestled like a rotted tooth between the hills of northeastern Pomerania. Generations had passed since Dr. Wilhelm Krantz's quiet death, and few remembered him by name. The villagers of nearby Ottenfeld simply called it Das Knochengut, the Bone House. Children were warned not to play near it. Local hunters avoided its woods. And in winter, when the mist curled low to the ground, the treetops around it seemed to lean inward, as if the land itself were trying to forget what it had once contained. But the Prussian state had no room for ghost stories. The empire was growing, and even ruins had a price. That year, the Ministry of Land and Taxation, under a sweeping property reallocation initiative, sent an assessor to catalog all unclaimed estates in the district. Among them was the Krantz property, marked in the ledger as unoccupied. No known heirs. Last documented activity, 1851. The man they sent was Friedrich Lamm, a 41-year-old civil functionary from Stettin. He was not the sort of man who believed in hauntings. He believed in maps, in signatures, in tax records and water rights. He arrived by carriage in early May, accompanied by a hired laborer and a trunk filled with surveying tools, ledgers, and a revolver he'd never used. The journey took 3 days, much of it through unmarked woodlands. By the time they reached the Krantz estate, the path had all but vanished, consumed by roots and underbrush. The house itself stood like a mausoleum among trees, its windows hollow, its outer stones green with moss, its once imposing doors warped and sunken inward. Lamm's laborer, a young man named Dieter, hesitated at the threshold. "It smells wrong," he said. But Lamm only shook his head. "Dust and animals. That's all." They pried open the double doors and stepped inside. What they found, at first, was merely decay. The main hall was thick with cobwebs. Floorboards buckled beneath their weight. Wallpaper peeled in great curls, revealing discolored plaster beneath. Rodents had long since made a home in the pantry and dining rooms. Yet the structure stood solid, its bones intact. Lamb began his work methodically. He mapped the manor room by room, sketching rough diagrams and noting damages. In the study, he found a desk covered in dust and a ledger dated 1851, the last entry pinned in a cramped, slanting hand. He did not recognize the name, but he copied it down, Wilhelm Krantz. Then he descended into the cellar. The door was hidden behind a false wall in the pantry, obscured by wooden shelving and long-emptied wine racks. The lock had rusted shut. It took nearly an hour of crowbar work to breach it. The stench hit them immediately. Not rot, exactly. Something deeper, older. A kind of damp mineral stink, like old blood and limestone. The staircase descended into darkness. Lamb lit a lantern. Dieter refused to follow, mumbling something about Geisternochen, ghost bones, and excused himself to wait outside. Alone, Lamb descended. What he found was not a cellar in the usual sense. It was a gallery. The first chamber was long and low-ceilinged, lined with shelves made from blackened oak. Upon them sat bones, skulls, femurs, ribs, all arranged with care and precision. Each piece was labeled with a tag, not names, but numbers. Beneath the shelves, locked cabinets held glass jars filled with spinal discs, ligaments suspended in amber fluid, and rows of sawed cross-sections of human tibias, sliced like tree rings. Further in, he found the tables. There were 7, each over 6 feet long, carved from polished wood. Metal straps hung from the sides, rusted but still intact. Upon one of them sat a full skeleton, laid out like a diagram, bones wired together with meticulous intent. The skull was tilted to one side, its mouth slightly agape. On the wall above it, in faded ink, someone had written, Specimen 68, Failure of Synthesis, Remeasure. Lamb did not scream, but he dropped his ledger. Room after room revealed more of the same. Bones stacked in crates. Bones arranged in spiral patterns on the floor. Bones affixed to the walls in crude diagrams of musculature and joint structure. Some were children's. In the farthest chamber, Lamb found what appeared to be a furnace, a massive iron structure surrounded by soot-stained walls. Beside it sat barrels marked only with the symbol of a skull, and inside them, ash, mixed with fragments of jaw, finger, and tooth. He fled the house in silence. That night, the laborer Dieter left on foot, refusing payment. Lamb camped in his carriage, revolver at the ready, and did not sleep. When he returned to Stettin, he filed a report, one that never made it to public record. The Krantz estate was sealed, declared an unnatural site, and placed under military jurisdiction. But word spread, as it always does. A rumor here, a drunken tale there. By autumn, half the province whispered of the doctor who boiled bodies beneath his floor. They called the house cursed, haunted, and in some ways, they were right. But there was more. Weeks later, a special delegation from Berlin arrived to investigate the site. Among them were medical examiners, anthropologists, and archivists. Their findings, though heavily redacted in official documents, became the foundation for what would later be called the Krantz Archive, a collection of journals, anatomical diagrams, and preserved remains now kept under lock and key at an undisclosed facility. Inside the archive were Krantz's journals, hundreds of pages, written in tight, looping script, detailing not just his research, but his thoughts, his descent. In one entry, he wrote, "They do not suffer. They are chosen, to be rendered, studied, recorded. The living forget their bones, but I do not. I give them purpose. I make them eternal." In another, "I dreamed of a cathedral made of femurs. No choir, only breath through marrow. I woke with ash in my mouth." The journals reveal something deeper than madness. A system, a belief. Krantz had not merely killed. He had selected, measured, catalogued. He believed that certain skeletal configurations, angles of jaw, density of hip, curve of spine, were not accidents of birth, but markers of something essential. He called it the architecture of worth. Specimen 73, high cranial vault. Superior bone resonance. Specimen 81, inadequate tibial symmetry. Discarded. There was no pattern to who lived or died. Only bone. The team uncovered the remains of at least 200 individuals. Most were complete skeletons. None were documented cadavers. There were men and women, young and old. Some showed evidence of surgical modification, sections cut away, cavities bored into marrow. One skull had been etched with a scalpel, concentric circles spiraling inward toward the crown. The lead examiner, Dr. Gustav Eller, wrote in a confidential memorandum, "This is not science. This is ritual." He was building something. Not just knowledge, but a kind of language. The dead here do not rest. They were spoken through. After the investigation, the estate was burned to the ground. But they could not bring themselves to burn the bones. They were taken away, piece by piece, in sealed crates. Where they are now, no one can say. The Krantz archive remains sealed, its contents the subject of debate among historians, forensic scientists, and the rare few allowed access. Some claim that among the records are references to anatomical harmonies, pairings of bones that produce acoustic resonance when struck together. Others say Krantz believed he could hear thoughts in the echo of femurs dropped onto stone. But perhaps the most unsettling document found was a single note, and signed, tucked into the final volume of his journals. It read, "I am not alone in this. There are others. You will not find them until it is too late. We do not die. We are catalogued." The note was written in a different hand. The Krantz archive was supposed to have been destroyed in 1943, burned with hundreds of others in the air raids over Berlin. That was the official story. It had been requisitioned by the Reich's Anatomical Commission in 1937, studied, indexed, and reportedly discredited. Not science, they had claimed. Degenerate mysticism wrapped in the skin of medicine. A warning, if anything, not a contribution. And when the bombs fell, so too did the legacy of the Bone House. But paper has a way of surviving. Ink crawls into margins that fire forgets. And sometimes, what should have been lost finds a new reader. In 1994, nearly a century and a half after Dr. Wilhelm Krantz sealed the last of his anatomical journals, a doctoral student named Lena Voss found a reference to his name in the most unlikely of places, a footnote in a dusty, untranslated monograph on 19th-century Prussian bone ossuaries. It was nothing more than a line. Not unlike the harmonic structuring attributed to the Krantz specimens, Archiv, Verboten, Stettin, circa 1850 to 1852. The term struck her immediately, harmonic structuring. Lena had spent the past 3 years studying the ritual use of sound in early medical procedures, how music, vibration, and voice had been used not just to soothe, but to structure. It was niche work and often mocked. But here was something different. A hidden archive, a forbidden one. From a time when medicine walked closer to magic than science. She dug. The Stettin archive no longer existed. That city had become Szczecin, Poland, after the war. But fragments had survived. Some were relocated to private holdings in Rostock. Others were scattered into university collections, misfiled, mislabeled, and forgotten. She applied for grants, lied on access forms, and begged curators. She traveled from Leipzig to Bremen to Krakow, collecting each page like a priest gathering relics of a long-dead saint. What she found was incomplete, but unmistakable. There were hand-drawn diagrams of skeletons posed in impossible configurations, like dancers mid-prayer. Not anatomical charts, ritual ones. There were notes written in mirror script, cataloging the tonal pitch produced when certain bones were struck against brass or wood. There was an entry labeled Chamber D. Femurs from 8 individuals placed tip to tip in a radial circle. Struck sequentially. Resultant tone resembled E minor triad. Sustained vibration for 11 seconds. Observer reported sensation of shared memory. No visible source of resonance. And then, a short note on something called the hum. After third arrangement, bones no longer silent. Even untouched, they responded. Low harmonic, subterranean. Possibly residual imprint. Uncertain if tonal or mnemonic. Lena could not explain why, but reading the notes made her feel as though someone was standing just behind her shoulder. Not watching, listening. Her colleagues mocked her. The bone whisperer, they called her behind her back. But her funding continued, quietly, and from unnamed sources. By the fall of 1996, she had assembled over 300 pages of Krantz's notes. Then she found something else. A box. It arrived anonymously at her university office. No return address. Inside, wrapped in layers of linen and oilskin, was a femur. Human. Polished. Carved with concentric circles down its shaft. just like the description from Chamber B of the Krantz estate. And beneath it, a note, written in the same hand as the final journal entry from the Krantz archive. The resonance is not contained. It is inherited. She should have called the authorities. She didn't. Instead, she began her own experiments. She cleaned the femur. She suspended it in a sound isolation chamber. Using mallets, tuning forks, and eventually her own voice, she tried to recreate the tonal vibrations described in the archive. For weeks, nothing. Then one night, at 3:12 a.m., she struck it with a brass rod tuned to 174 hertz. The bone sang. A low pressure in her jaw, a pulse behind her eyes. The lab's recording equipment registered nothing, no measurable sound. But Lena began to dream. At first, they were fragmentary. Dim corridors, faces without skin, whispers in a language that felt too close to Latin. She saw a cathedral built of bone. 7 altars, each with a different instrument carved from human remains. She kept dreaming. By the second week, she could no longer distinguish whether she was sleeping. Her notebooks became erratic. Paragraphs interrupted mid-sentence by symbols, mirrored letters, or lists of measurements. She began carving. When her colleagues asked about the clicking sounds from her lab at night, she smiled politely and said she was working on resonant modeling. When the janitor found her asleep on the floor surrounded by femur diagrams, she claimed she was meditating. No one questioned her too deeply. Then she stopped attending lectures. Her students complained. Her supervisor tried to intervene, but by then, she had locked herself in her lab. Security forced the door. What they found was enough to warrant a quiet internal inquiry, though it never reached the press. The bone was gone. Her diagrams had multiplied, floor to ceiling, every wall covered in sketches of bone arrangements, spirals, grids, lattices of vertebrae intersected with drawn sound waves. On the floor, written in blood, was a circle. Inside it, 7 femur-length grooves, perfectly spaced. A tuning fork lay at the center. Lena was found kneeling in the corner, humming a low, unbroken note. Her eyes were open, but unfocused. Her fingernails were torn and bloodied from scraping the floor. When spoken to, she only replied with a whisper. "They're not dead. They're ordered." She was taken to a secure facility, diagnosed with acute stress psychosis. Her work was impounded, her name quietly removed from departmental listings. But the archive didn't die with her. Someone leaked the documents, and in turn, a janitor, perhaps one of the night security staff who had seen the floor that night and taken photographs. The files made their way to the deep web, then to academic conspiracists, then to forums too niche to be noticed by authorities. In one of them, a user posted the following. "The Krantz harmonics are real. I've tested 3 bones. The resonance opens something. It's not about the dead, it's about the arrangement. Like music. But the notes are people." Another replied, "You don't play the bones. The bones play you." That's how he heard them. By 2004, whispers of the archive resurfaced in private occult circles. A Berlin musician released an album using sounds derived from ultrasonic bone resonance, subaudible tones reportedly harvested from preserved remains. The final track was titled Specimen 109, Spine/Chalice. That musician vanished 2 months later. In 2011, a warehouse fire in Dresden revealed dozens of anatomical specimens arranged in circular formations on the basement floor. No suspects were named, but among the evidence, police found a reproduction of the Krantz circle, an almost perfect match to what Lena had drawn in her lab. And in 2022, at a private auction in Zurich, a single femur etched with concentric spirals sold for $1.2 million to an anonymous bidder. It is unknown how many bones survived, or how many of Krantz's disciples, or imitators, still exist. But one fact is certain. The bone house did not burn. It moved. In the cold of February 2023, forensic pathologist Nils Baumann arrived at a decommissioned psychiatric facility just outside Leipzig. It was supposed to be a weekend project, quiet, unofficial. An off-the-books favor for a university archivist who had received a set of mislabeled boxes during a cataloging transfer. All they knew was the original source. Buchwald Sanatorium, shuttered in 1971 after decades of abuse allegations, unverified medical procedures, and at least 18 patient disappearances between 1923 and 1969. Nils had a fascination with places like this. Not just the pathology, but the history, The failures of old medicine, the arrogance behind obsolete diagnoses, and the ghost science left behind. But he also had another interest, one he never brought up at conferences or over drinks with colleagues. An obsession he kept to quiet, late nights in his apartment, the Krantz Archive. He had read the conspiracy threads, listened to the distorted bone resonance recordings that circulated online, even tracked down a few of the forbidden diagrams. It was nonsense, of course, mostly, but it haunted him. The spiral-carved femurs, the arrangement circles, the whisper of an idea that the body could be rewritten, not with scalpel or gene, but with pattern, with sound. He didn't expect to find anything related to Krantz at Buchwald. That's what he told himself. But within minutes of entering the asylum's sub-level archive, he found something impossible. A single photograph, black and white, dated 1932, labeled in German. Versuchsreihe 8, Replication nach Krantz. Experiment Series 8, Replication after Krantz. The image showed 7 bones, femurs, clean and arranged in a perfect heptagon, resting in a chalk circle on the tiled floor of an observation room. A young doctor in a white coat stood behind them, eyes obscured by motion blur. But on the wall behind him, clearly visible, the spiral symbol. Just like Lena Voss had drawn. Just like the notes from Chamber B. Nils sat back, heart thudding. This wasn't just an echo of the archive, it was a direct copy. Someone at Buchwald had rebuilt the Krantz experiments, nearly 80 years after Wilhelm Krantz had died. He dug deeper. By the second day, he had found patient files, some with strange notations. Pages labeled disrupted harmonics, tonale unruh, tonal restlessness, and most disturbing, skeletal geometry, Anordnung, Versuch 9. Skeletal geometry, arrangement test 9. The records were filled with references to audio hallucinations, patients claiming their bones were vibrating, or that they heard singing from inside their skulls. One entry simply read, Patient 23 entered coma during procedure 3. Body remained warm for 11 days. Heart silent. Brain activity unstable. Bone resonance, unchanged. That was the word that kept returning. Resonance. It wasn't a metaphor for these doctors. It was a measurement. And there was more. Hidden behind a false wall in the lowest level of the archive, a trick of old plaster and rot, Nils found room 12K. Not on any blueprints. Not on any map. Its door was metal, windowless, and rusted shut until he levered it open with an iron bar. Inside, dust, black mold, silence. And a circle, carved into the floor. Deep, almost machine-precise. At each of the 7 points, a small square recess in the tile. As if something had once been placed there. Something bone-shaped. On the far wall, more carvings. Spirals. Grids. The same diagrams from Krantz's journals. But older, faded, and tagged with patient numbers. Nils didn't sleep that night. He took photographs, made sketches, swabbed for samples. But the room itself had a weight, a pressure, like something held its breath beneath the floor. When he touched the carvings, he swore he could hear something, not a sound, but a sensation, like being near an idling engine, a hum in his teeth. By day 3, Nils stopped calling the university archivist. He didn't want anyone else here. Not yet. Then came the box. It was sitting outside room 12K when he returned. No label, no dust, as if freshly placed. Inside were 7 femurs. Clean, spiral carved, and underneath them, a tape recorder. Cassette. No markings. Nils didn't play it at first. He just stared at it, breath ragged. Then, alone in that forgotten basement, he pressed play. Static. Then a voice. Low, male, German, shaking slightly. Arrangement 8. Bones placed at correct interval. 34 seconds into exposure. Tone begins. No discernible source. Room temperature decreases by 2.3 degrees. Observer reports visual distortion. Subject begins to respond. Then silence. Then something else. A sound. Low. Subaudible. But Nils felt it. He staggered back. His vision blurred at the edges. For a second, the entire room seemed to tilt. And just beneath the pitch, so low it wasn't heard but sensed, he swore there was a voice. Whispering in perfect rhythm. Not words. Not in any language. But instructions. That night, Nils recorded his first dream in over 6 years. He was in a circular room, lit by no source. 7 shadows stood in a heptagonal ring, each holding a bone above their head. In the center, Something writhed beneath a cloth. Something that breathed without lungs. When he woke, he had drawn it. Spiral after spiral, layered over bones. Like Krantz. Like Lena. The next day, he began arranging the bones. Not replicas. The ones from the box. He placed them in the carved circle, tip to tip, just like in the photo. He measured the distances. Matched the angles. Then, against all caution, he struck the center with a tuning fork. No sound. At first. But then, the walls shook. Not physically, but perceptually. The air in the room felt folded. Dense. Like being underwater. His teeth ached. His eyes watered. And then he saw them. Figures. Flickering at the edges of the circle. Not ghosts, not people. Impressions. As if the bones were remembering those they once were. Echoes carved into calcium. And the hum grew louder. He staggered away. Fled the facility. Locked the door behind him. Drove without stopping. But the hum didn't leave him. Days later, back in Berlin, he began hearing it again. In traffic. In silence. In the gaps between conversation. A low harmonic, constant and shifting. As if the bones were still with him. He tried to destroy the photographs. They reappeared. He tried to delete the recorder file. It would not erase. He mailed the bones to an incinerator lab. They were returned the next week. Untouched. No explanation. Then came the email. No address. No subject line. Just a single sentence. The arrangement is not finished. You opened 8. Now you must find 9. And a second file. Audio. Labeled simply. Krantz _pattern_ 9.wave. Nils didn't listen to it. Not yet. But he began dreaming again. And in the dreams, he is no longer observing the circle. He is inside it. The journal had no name. No date on the first page. Only a stamp from Buchwald Sanatorium and a patient number, number 23. But whoever wrote it, they had lived through something. The book had been hidden, wrapped in linen, sealed with wax, and buried beneath a loose tile in room 12K. Forensic pathologist Nils Baumann found it during his final hours inside the abandoned sanatorium, just after fleeing from his own brief exposure to the 8th arrangement. The paper was soft with age. The ink faded, often smeared by water or time. But the handwriting was frantic, purposeful. Some entries were neatly composed. Others looked like they were written mid-seizure, the letters jagged, breaking across margins, looping in on themselves. But the story was clear. Or, rather, what remained of the story. This is a reconstruction of patient number 23's journal, translated from the original German. Entry 1. I've been moved to the lower level. They say I responded well to the sleep study. But the air here is thicker. The nurses don't come as often. My meals are late. The walls sweat. Last night, I heard music under the floor. Entry 2. Not music, no. Rhythm. Like something breathing through a reed. Or like a voice speaking inside a throat that no longer knows how to shape words. The others hear it too. We don't talk about it. Entry 4. They took her Gran. Rolled his bed down the hall at night. We heard his voice bouncing off the tiles. He wasn't screaming. He was singing. The next morning, his bed was gone. The floor mopped twice. Entry 7. They came for me tonight. Not doctors. The ones in the coats with no faces. Not blank, just unremembered. I try to picture them now, and all I see is the spiral. It's burned behind my eyelids. I blink, and it turns. They made me stand in a circle. 7 others. All barefoot, bone thin. All holding their arms straight out, palms facing one another. In the center, a stack of bones. Arranged like spokes of a wheel. But wrong. Too symmetrical. Too clean. One of the faceless ones struck a tuning fork and held it to the floor. Then the air changed. Entry 8. Time is not moving the same here. I sleep and wake and sleep again, but the light never changes. The sound never stops. It's not even sound now. It's something under sound. I feel it in my spine. When I breathe, it answers. I think I'm being tuned. Not like an instrument. Like a chime. My teeth hurt. Entry 10. My bones are warm. Even when I touch cold water, my arms stay warm. Not like fever, like the core is hot. Like something is living inside the bone, pressing out. Entry 12. They put the spiral on the floor again today. Drew it in chalk this time. But I knew the shape before they finished. I know where the lines go. I know what the spiral wants. I said the word Krantz aloud. The nurse dropped her tray. How did I know that name? Entry 14. Last night, I remembered something that never happened. I was in a room made of bone, not stone. Every wall was ribbed, like vertebrae stacked to the ceiling. At the center, a woman with no eyes sang without breath. Her voice was in the spiral. I knew her name. Lena. Entry 16. The experiment was supposed to stop. They said arrangement 8 would be the final. But I think someone reversed the order. The arrangement arranges itself. The bones remember. The bones teach. The bones command. Entry 18. I haven't seen the sun in what feels like weeks. But I saw a room made of glass today. Inside it, I saw myself, but wrong. My bones had changed shape. They curved with purpose. Like tools. I was standing in the circle. And I was humming. The hum was not mine. It was older than air. Entry 21. They tried to take the bones away last night. One of the orderlies dropped one. It broke. The sound that came out was not from this world. The lights shattered. 3 patients began speaking in unison, an old dialect, dead for 200 years. We all heard it. The bones were singing. Entry 24. I am starting to understand the pattern. Not through math. Not through diagrams. Through dream. The spiral doesn't show the shape of the body. It shows the shape the body wants to become. It was never about surgery. Never about study. It was about invitation. Entry 28. I think I am dead. My heart no longer beats. My breath is shallow. But I walk. I speak. I write this. The nurse does not respond to me anymore. She brings food, but never looks. I touch the walls. They don't react. I may be invisible. Or I may be outside time. Entry 31. I saw Wilhelm Krantz. In the corridor. He didn't age. His coat was stained, but the eyes were the same. He looked at me and said one word. Repeat. Entry 33. This is not a sanatorium. It never was. It is a bell. And we are inside the bell. The arrangements are the clapper. When all 7 align, the bell will ring. Entry 36. The bones are forming the circle again, even without hands to place them. Something stirs beneath room 12K. It has always stirred. My fingers are changing. The joints respond to the tone. I can no longer write straight lines. I see the spiral even when I close my eyes. Final entry. I understand now. I was never a patient. I was part of the instrument. The arrangement must complete. One bone is missing. One voice. One breath. I will place myself in the circle. May the tone pass through me unbroken. They were discovered in a rusted tin box beneath the floorboards of a collapsed barn on the outskirts of Königsberg. The year was 1921, and the man who found them, Carl Fischer, a scavenger by trade, was looking for copper wiring. Instead, he found a cache of letters, all written in the same fastidious hand, and all signed by a name long thought buried in shame and dust. Wilhelm Krantz. The letters were not addressed to any official medical board, nor to family or fellow researchers. They were written to a woman named Magda, a name that appears nowhere in the registries of Buchwald, nor in any census from the years surrounding Krantz's work. And yet her name appeared on every envelope, always with reverence, always with sorrow. The first letter is dated March 2nd, 1849. The handwriting is precise, if strained, and the paper smells of mildew and old resin. The tone is soft at first, not the voice of a killer or a madman, but of a man uncertain how to carry the weight of what he has begun. Magda, I dream of you in the winter garden. The wind through your hair is louder than any cathedral bell. There is something divine in the way silence surrounded you. I cannot hear that silence anymore. The walls of this place breathe. This chapter unfolds through these letters, his descent, his justifications, and ultimately, his final, horrific plan. It is not a confession in the traditional sense. Krantz does not believe himself guilty. He believes himself chosen. In later letters, Krantz begins to describe his experiments with language that borders on religious fervor. The marrow sings, Magda. Not metaphorically. The body is an instrument if one is willing to scrape away the meat. I have found, at last, the true pitch of the soul. He speaks of the patients not as people, but as templates, vessels for resonance. He refers repeatedly to something he calls the ninth arrangement, a sequence of sound and geometry he claims was dictated to him in a fever dream after his third self-surgery. They mock me, Magda. The board calls my work grotesque. They do not see what I see, a map of the divine etched into calcium. I believe the soul is not housed in the heart or mind, but in the frequency of the body, the hum beneath the blood. As the letters progress, the handwriting deteriorates. Diagrams begin to appear, Skulls opened like seed pods, vertebrae arranged in concentric spirals. By letter 12, he is no longer addressing Magda directly. He refers to her in the third person, as if she were part of the audience observing him from some celestial balcony. She would have understood. She always heard the quiet. Even in childhood, I watched her listen to the wind and tilt her head like a wolf scenting home. Then, in the letter dated October 8, 1850, a chilling shift. The others were flawed, ill-proportioned, asymmetrical, but she had symmetry. Her bones rang clear. Her breath kept time. I needed only to ask her to lie still. She did. She trusted me. Historians and forensic linguists believe this to be the moment Krantz crossed the final line. Magda, whoever she truly was, had become the eighth arrangement. The final letter isn't signed. She is in the walls now. Not metaphor. Not madness. She guides the tone. I hear her in the corridors. Not screaming. Not accusing. Singing. When Carl Fischer attempted to sell the letters to a Berlin museum in 1923, he was arrested instead. The letters vanished into private hands until they reappeared, anonymously scanned and uploaded to a now-defunct server belonging to a university in Vienna. Since then, several listeners of the Sinister History Stories podcast have claimed they printed the letters and heard a high, almost imperceptible chime while reading them aloud. Only one read the final letter to the end. He has not spoken since. In the room where he sat, every bone in a nearby cadaver study had been arranged into a perfect spiral by morning. The letters of Wilhelm Krantz were not merely relics. They were instruction, and perhaps they were never meant to be read. By the time winter laid its frozen hand upon Buchwald in the early weeks of 1851, the villagers were already whispering. Livestock were found dismembered, not in the way wolves or wild dogs might leave them, but meticulously, surgically. Each carcass bore no ragged edge, no sign of hunger, only the cold deliberation of a knife that understood anatomy too well. Most disturbing of all, some were arranged in twisted formations, horns spiraling inward, femurs laid out like spokes from a central stone. There were other signs, too, an unease that settled like a fog over the estate. The flicker of gaslight at impossible hours from the upper windows of the bone house. A humming sound, low and constant, which a few said came from the cellars and carried through the pipes like breath in a throat. A young stable boy, Janek, had once claimed he saw something human-shaped but not quite right, standing barefoot in the snow just beyond the tree-line behind Krantz's manor. It didn't move. It just watched. When he told the innkeeper, the man didn't laugh. He only poured Janek another drink and said, "Don't ever look back at that house." Behind locked doors, Wilhelm Krantz had stopped referring to his workspace as a laboratory. He now called it the choir hall. The walls were lined with bones, some bleached, some still speckled with traces of sinew. Vertebrae formed concentric ovals like the shell of an ammonite. Skulls, each carefully drilled and smoothed, were set at equal intervals on shelves of dark walnut. Every week, a new specimen was added to the formation, but Krantz no longer kept records of who they had once been. The cataloging had ceased. Names had become irrelevant. He believed he was building a resonator. Every evening, Krantz would seat himself at the center of the room and play a bowed instrument he had constructed from human rib bones and catgut. The sound was unbearable to anyone who heard it from the outside, a keening moan that seemed to press against the walls of the skull and make the stomach turn. But to Krantz, it was a language, a way of calling out into the unknown. He wrote in his private journals. They begin to answer, not in words, but in pressure, a gravity in the room. I believe I am close. The eighth arrangement failed not because of fault, but because she was alone. The ninth must be collective, a choir of bone. He was no longer alone in the bone house. Though no assistants had been seen entering or leaving, neighbors swore they saw faces in the windows at night. Pale, expressionless faces, peering from behind lace curtains that hadn't moved in decades. One woman, Frau Elbier, claimed she saw two such figures standing behind Krantz as he walked the eastern wing with a lantern. She told her husband what she saw. The next morning, her husband was found in the woods, hung upside down by his ankles, his mouth packed with lichen and his eyes missing. Inside the bone house, in a chamber Krantz referred to as the central echo, he had constructed the spiral. The spiral was a pattern of bone arranged meticulously on the floor in a widening swirl. From above, it looked like an eye. From within, it distorted sound. When Krantz stood in the center and spoke, his voice echoed back not just with delay, but with changes, as though someone, or something, was replying. The journal entry from January 9th, 1851, reads, "The spiral awakens. When I speak within it, she answers. Not Magda, not anymore. This is older, deeper. The arrangement is a key, and I have unlocked the first of 9 doors." He began selecting his victims more deliberately. He sought not just bodies, but tones. People with voices that resonated within a certain frequency. He would invite them to his home under pretense of consultation, praise their unique vocal qualities, and then drug them with laudanum tea. What followed was recorded only in sketches, most of them torn or blackened with ash. Krantz believed that if he assembled the right combination of tones, each represented by a skeleton carefully tuned and arranged within the spiral, he could summon something. Not God. Not exactly. He called it the architect. He claimed the architect lived between vibrations, in the silence between heartbeats, in the breath between prayers. He believed the spiral would make his body a vessel for its entrance. The townspeople, despite their unease, still avoided direct confrontation. But one man, an ex-priest named Kappel, began asking questions. He gathered a group of locals to watch the house. On February 2nd, the sky went dark by noon. The wind dropped. The snow stopped falling. And then the humming began again, louder than ever before. By midnight, the spiral had been completed. Krantz had recorded it in his final notebook, which was later discovered in the lining of a medical satchel buried beneath the foundation of the bone house. The last page bore no diagrams, no text, just a smear of blood and a single word, written in trembling script. Inside, when authorities finally entered the estate weeks later, Krantz was gone. But the spiral remained. Perfect, untouched by weather, time, or decay. Those who entered the spiral reported strange sensations, sudden nosebleeds, disorientation, weeping without cause. One man spoke in a voice not his own for several minutes before collapsing. Another simply walked into the center and began singing in Latin, despite never learning the language. The spiral found in the flesh was not art. It was not science. It was a summoning. It was a storm that revealed them. In the winter of 1925, a rare wind tore through the hills outside Buchwald, toppling the skeletal remnants of the old estate barn, the same one under which Wilhelm Krantz's rusted letters had once been found. This time, it wasn't a box or a cache of writings hidden beneath floorboards. This time, the earth gave up something colder. They were called the choir by locals who dared to venture near the grounds. It began with a single skull, rolled down the hillside, washed clean by the melting snow. Then came a clavicle, 2 ribs, and finally, after a boy stumbled upon an exposed spine, a full excavation. Authorities were summoned, but the word had already spread before they arrived. The Krantz estate had sung again. The choir wasn't a metaphor. Not this time. In a buried room beneath the collapsed barn, sealed off with slabs of limestone and tar, they found 31 complete skeletons. Each had been arranged in a circular pattern on the ground, arms extended to form a ring. Where their mouths had once been were brass fittings, fused to the bone. Tiny metal reeds were embedded in the pharyngeal space, like pipe organ tongues. Every mouth was prepared to sing. But it wasn't just a grotesque arrangement. The acoustics of the chamber had been altered. Thin sheets of polished bone lined the walls, likely human, acting as resonators. At the center of the room was a narrow, hollow pillar, carved from some dense mineral, perhaps basalt, etched with unfamiliar sigils. Instruments of both surgical and musical origin were found at the base: scalpels, tuning forks, bone saws, and a strange device resembling a wind-up metronome connected to thin, copper tubing. One investigator, a physicist named Gerhard Nold, refused to enter the room after placing his ear to the stone. He claimed he heard singing, not echo, not wind, but actual notes, rising in perfect intervals. He vomited moments later and left the site. He never returned to science. The official report listed the chamber as a failed acoustics experiment, likely part of Krantz's deranged anatomical studies. But some of the skeletons were dated to long after Krantz was presumed dead. One had a dental implant style from 1864. Another, a fractured radius clearly reset with a steel brace manufactured in 1871. If Krantz died in 1851, as the records suggest, who arranged the choir? Whispers of the choir spread quickly through Buchwald and neighboring towns. Children dared one another to walk the forest path that led to the ruin. The brave ones claimed to hear soft humming if they stayed quiet long enough. Others spoke of sudden nosebleeds or disorientation when crossing the hill. One girl, Lissel Braun, disappeared for 2 nights. When she was found sleeping beside the barn, she could only repeat one word: listen. But the horror did not stop at the sight. Weeks later, Father Hugo, the priest at the nearby abbey, reported strange behavior among his choir boys. During practice, the boys began shifting key without direction, all modulating upward in strange, microtonal steps. It was barely perceptible at first, until one rehearsal ended with the youngest boy screaming and bleeding from the ears. When asked what had happened, he only replied, "I was trying to match her. Her, not them." That same week, a widow named Marta Lenk was found dead in her home. Her body had collapsed backward over a broken chair. Her throat was torn open, not with a weapon but with great force, as if something inside her had ruptured outward. On the wall was a smear of blood, trailing downward in the shape of a spiral. Investigators returned to the barn, only to find the bones of the choir had been disturbed. The circle was broken. 4 of the skeletons were missing. No footprints, no drag marks, just absence. A scholar from Berlin, Elise Korner, attempted to explain the phenomenon in her now-withdrawn paper, Symphonic Necrology. She posited that Krantz's work had become something far beyond anatomy, a form of posthumous resonance, a living frequency sustained in bone. She believed the choir was not symbolic, but functional, a machine of human construction built not for the body, but for the soul. She disappeared from public record in 1926. Her final telegram simply read, "I heard her. In the marrow. I think she's moving." The choir, locals say, was never meant to be found. It was a lock, not a song. But now, the lock had been broken, and something beneath Buchwald had begun to listen back. They say the 9th was never meant to be completed. In Wilhelm Krantz's own letters, the first 8 arrangements had physical, tangible forms: spirals of bone, arches of vertebrae, harmonics carved into femurs. Each arrangement, a grotesque expression of the man's need to map the soul through symmetry, sound, and suffering. But the 9th? It remained elusive, obscured in metaphor, a culmination hinted at, never described. Until the day the doors were found. In 1931, a team of engineers arrived in Buchwald to begin surveying the land for a new dam project that would redirect the nearby river and generate electricity for the region. During routine excavation, the team uncovered an underground vault, an architectural anomaly hidden beneath a knoll a quarter-mile from the ruins of the Krantz estate. Unlike the crude cellar of the Bone House, this vault was pristine, unweathered stone, seamless joints, and a pair of steel-ribbed doors covered in ancient, musical notations. The doors had no handle, no lock, just a smooth central disc embedded with 9 grooves, arranged in a spiral. It took days before someone realized it was a tuning plate. The discovery was turned over to the regional authorities. A musicologist from Leipzig, Clara Vogel, was brought in to study the notations. Her findings were strange. Each groove corresponded to a specific frequency, 8 of them matching known pitches in Western music, the 9th falling between 2 half-steps, in what she called an impossible tone. Clara insisted the 9th groove could not be replicated with existing instruments. It required a voice, or something that could bend pitch in a way not human. Yet when one of the workers whistled close to it, entirely by accident, the central disc clicked. The doors opened. Behind them was a staircase that descended for 27 steps, each step inlaid with bone. The air was dry, silent. No scent of rot, no sound of wind, only a pressure in the ears, like descending into water. The chamber at the bottom was circular, domed, and featureless, except for a single raised platform in the center, upon which stood a chair. A human-sized chair, crafted entirely from pelvic bones. Embedded in the walls were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of shallow niches, each holding fragments of bone etched with symbols. Each fragment hummed faintly when approached, like a tuning fork struck just below perception. Clara did not leave the chamber for 16 hours. When the others returned, they found her seated in the bone chair, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, and tears on her cheeks. She whispered only 2 words, "She's still." And then, "She's waiting." From Clara's notes, we learn of her growing obsession with what she called the 9th arrangement. The 8 before were keys. Not to open a door, but to arrange a throat. To harmonize the bones. The 9th is not a pitch. It is a position, a configuration of will, a tuning of the soul. Her writings grow more abstract. Diagrams appear in the margins, bodies folded in impossible angles, spines reshaped like clefts, skulls opened and balanced upon tuning forks. Clara began referring to the choir not as victims, but as disciples. She believed their resonance had not ended with death. Their mouths were tuned. Their bones still ring. The choir did not sing for us. It sang through us. Weeks after the vault's discovery, Clara vanished. Her last letter was addressed not to family, nor colleagues, but to Wilhelm Krantz himself. "I see now. You were never mad. You were only early. The flesh forgets. The bone remembers. I will bring her the 9th. The chair was found empty. The chamber, sealed. And the vault? Buried beneath concrete. The dam was completed. The valley flooded. But some say on cold, clear nights, when the water is still and the moonlight breaks across its surface, you can hear a thin, shimmering note. Not music, not wind, just the voice of someone who has learned how to hum in the key of bone." The morning she returned, the bells in Buchwald rang by themselves. It was early spring, 1934. The last frost had barely lifted from the village roofs when the sound echoed down from the church tower. No hands had pulled the rope. No one had ascended the steps. Yet the bells pealed out 4 times, low, deliberate tolls that drew half the town into the square beneath gray skies. The priest, Father Hugo's successor, stood at the base of the tower swearing he had just come from morning prayers. He had not rung the bell. That same hour, Lissel Braun, who had vanished near the Krantz ruins 9 years before, staggered out from the woods. She was barefoot, wearing the same gray dress she had disappeared in as a child. Her skin was pale and unwrinkled, despite the years. Her eyes were milk blue, blind but watchful. She stopped in front of the village well and whispered a single word. 8th. By the time the authorities arrived, she had collapsed. Doctors at the clinic were baffled. Though Lissel now appeared 19 or 20, her biology told a different story. Her hair and nails had grown little since her disappearance. Her teeth were worn, not by time, but by friction, each molar smooth flat, as though something had been pressed between her jaws again and again. Her larynx showed unusual strain. The muscles of her throat were developed beyond what any speech or vocal exercise could explain. She was mute for the first 3 days, only scribbling numbers on the walls. 8s in rows, columns, spirals. On the 4th night, a nurse claimed to hear her humming softly, almost imperceptibly, in her sleep. When she placed her hand to Lissel's throat, she recoiled. It was vibrating, gently, as though her body had become a tuning fork. In the nights that followed, new disturbances were reported. The dam engineers who had sealed the vault in Chapter 10 now claimed that one of the sluice gates vibrated open without mechanical cause. Local radios crackled with static that morphed into tonal bursts, always in repeating sequences of 8. Pets whined. Cattle refused to drink from the river. Lissel awoke on the 7th night. She sat up in her cot at the clinic and said, in a voice that was not quite hers, "She needs one more." Then she screamed, not in terror, but in pitch. The glass windows shattered. 3 nurses collapsed. A 4th, standing too close, bled from both ears. The village called in Clara Vogel's former colleague, Dr. Reiter, a professor of applied acoustics who had previously denounced her findings. When shown the recordings of Lissel's scream, captured on a reel-to-reel by a nearby technician, he went pale. "This isn't vocal," he said. "This is structural. She's tuned to architecture." Reiter became convinced Lissel was not simply a girl returned, but the embodiment of the 8th arrangement, the 8th voice missing from the choir, the one that had vanished, the one whose absence had broken the circle. But if she had returned, it meant the choir had begun to reassemble. The next sign came 3 weeks later. A fisherman pulling his boat ashore from the flooded valley discovered a bone lodged in the hull. It was not fish bone, nor animal. It was human, and not from the freshly dead. A patina of time clung to it, but it had been polished, shaped, inscribed with a pattern that Ryder recognized instantly. It matched a diagram in Vogel's unpublished notes. A harmonically scored ulna. That night, Lissel vanished from the clinic. Her bed was undisturbed. The window was closed. The only sign she had left at all was the number 9 smeared in condensation on the mirror. And in the hours that followed, once again, the bells rang. Not 4 times, but 8. Villagers awoke to find the church doors wide open, though the locks remained engaged. Inside, hymnals had been opened, not to familiar psalms, but to blank pages. Only a single verse had been scrawled across the altar in ash. Bone to breath, breath to song. One more voice, and she is strong. The 8th had returned, but the 9th had yet to sing. The water does not ripple when the note begins. It vibrates, low, subsonic, like a prayer murmured in the throat of the earth itself. Not wind, not current, not storm, but a sustained, resonant hum that begins beneath the surface of the dam's reservoir. It moves through the valley like breath. Birds fall silent. Dogs whimper. Trees seem to lean in. April, 1934. A fortnight after Lissel Braun's second disappearance. The engineers at the Buchwald hydroelectric station were the first to hear it, if hearing is the right word. Reports logged on April 13th describe sudden shivering in steel girders. The turbine hull trembled, even when the machines were off. One technician, Klaus Henning, claimed the hair on his arms rose, like before a lightning strike, though skies were clear. Then came the dreams. Nearly every employee reported identical visions. Vast white corridors beneath water, shaped from bone and lit by an unseen sun. A woman walked the halls, faceless, humming. Her voice did not echo, yet the sound filled every corner. They would wake in sweat, mouth open, tongue dry. Sometimes their jaws ached, as if clenched all night. One man lost 2 molars in his sleep. No sign of trauma. On April 17th, the humming grew louder. A visiting inspector from Berlin brought a phonograph needle and pressed it to the concrete wall of the sluice. He caught a tone, a warble. Then the wax cylinder shattered. He said it felt as if the wall were singing. The authorities tried to dismiss it. Structural stress, sediment shifts, subaquatic vibrations. But those who worked there knew better. Something old and unfinished had begun again. Something that required resonance. And then, on the night of April 21st, the lake rose by an inch. There had been no rainfall. Divers were sent to investigate the intake tunnels. They never reached the bottom. 30 meters down, their gauges failed. One diver, Franz Ulrich, surfaced too quickly. His body convulsed. His final words, through bloody foam, were not his own. Not yet. Not until the 9th returns. His vocal cords had ruptured. In the days that followed, villagers gathered at the edge of the reservoir. At first, it was curiosity. Then it became ritual. Some swore they heard voices beneath the surface, fragmented, distorted, but undeniably human. Choral phrases half-formed, melodies unfinished. On April 25th, Father Hugo's successor, Father Reinhardt, led a blessing of the water. Midway through the ceremony, the bell tower rang again, 8 times. Reinhardt froze. A gust of wind, ice-cold, rippled through the congregation. And from the water's edge, Lissel Braun emerged. She was soaked, but not shivering. Her eyes glowed faintly blue, like the moon reflected on deep ice. She walked forward barefoot and silent, leaving no prints in the mud. Reaching the edge of the crowd, she held out her hand and pointed toward the dam. One voice, she said. One voice remains. Ryder arrived the next morning. He had abandoned his lectures. His beard was untrimmed, his coat stained. He brought with him a box, Clara Vogel's tuning forks, saved from the vault. He tested them near Lissel's presence. All 8 tones responded. But the 9th? It bent. She is bending the impossible tone, Ryder whispered. She is preparing it. The villagers built a platform near the water's edge. Lissel did not sleep. She stood atop the platform for 3 days, unmoving, eyes fixed on the dam. Her throat pulsed visibly. The hum grew more complex, layered now, as if other voices joined hers, though no mouths moved. On the 3rd night, the dreams returned. But they were no longer visions of corridors. Now they saw the bone house, reconstructed, complete, shining with wet bone and golden light. They heard the choir, not screaming, but singing. Harmony so perfect it made the dreamers weep. At the center of it all sat a throne, and on it, a figure without a face. Not Clara, not Wilhelm, something else. On May 1st, the reservoir dropped by an inch. Divers found no cracks, no leaks. But beneath the surface, something had changed. The lakebed had opened slightly. A fissure, narrow, spiraled, and pulsing faintly with light. Ryder returned to his notes. He found what he feared, a sketch of the ninth arrangement, described only in Vogel's final letter. It is not a harmony of sound, but of surrender. 9 is the circle closed, the door sealed, the choir complete. Ryder begged the town to evacuate. He pleaded with the engineers to shut down the dam, to seal the lake. But Lissel sang. That night, the sky cracked. Thunder without storm, light without source. And the hum became a song. One note. Sustained. Impossible. On May 2nd, the dam cracked. They heard it first in the pipes. Just after midnight on a Thursday, 3 days after Lissel Braun vanished again, the hum returned. It began in the old Buchwald schoolhouse, where the janitor, Herr Dietz, a man deaf in one ear, was scrubbing chalk from the boards when he felt it. A soft pressure in the soles of his feet, like standing on a plucked cello string. Moments later, the building's radiators shivered with a low, sustained note, one that seemed to come from inside the walls. By morning, the sound had spread. The townspeople described it as a kind of humming, not electrical, not mechanical. Organic, like a woman singing from beneath the floorboards. Ryder returned, now fully obsessed. He carried Clara Vogel's notes under his arm, pages now torn and yellowed with age, scrawled over with his own fevered annotations. He no longer denied her theories. He embraced them with a kind of wild-eyed devotion, warning the mayor that the vibrations were not mere resonance, but ritual. The choir is forming, he said, tapping his notes. They are singing back into existence. He became convinced the water table itself, newly shifted by the dam, was acting as a conductor, carrying subterranean frequencies from the vault below. Ryder spent nights at the river with tuning forks, glass flasks, and field microphones. On the third night, he captured something. When amplified, the recording revealed layers of tonal structures, not quite music, but ordered, deliberate. 8 interwoven frequencies, pulsing like breath. Beneath them, a ninth tone, quieter, discordant, rising. Ryder played it for the priest, who wept. Then he played it for the town council, who called the state ministry. And then, finally, he played it for the last surviving member of Clara Vogel's team, a linguist named Emilia Krantz. Emilia had gone blind in one eye since the Krantz vault had been sealed. She'd retreated to a sanatorium outside Berlin, where she spent her days transcribing medieval glossolalia from memory. When she heard the tape, she dropped her cane. They're forming language, she whispered. She's not humming. She's praying. A town meeting was called. Arguments broke out. Some demanded the church be exorcised. Others wanted the dam torn down. But it was too late. The choir had already begun their next movement. That night, the children of Buchwald began to speak in rhyme. They sang to themselves while drawing on walls and windows. They carved spirals into desks. One boy, Uli, recited a verse in perfect Latin, though he had never studied it. Another girl, Mara, was found at 2 a.m. sitting in her backyard, whispering a melody that caused the dog to convulse and die. In the days that followed, 5 families fled. 7 radios exploded. The town pharmacist drowned herself in a washtub after claiming she could hear the faucet breathing. And all the while, Lissel remained gone. Then, on the first Sunday of the new month, the church choir met for practice. There were 8 of them, 7 women and a boy of 15. They gathered as usual, though each had suffered dreams the night before. Dreams of roots in bone, mouths stitched shut, and an endless corridor of vertebrae humming like a harp. As they began to sing, none noticed that the organ had begun to play itself. The hymn they sang was not in the binder. It wasn't in any hymnal. One by one, each chorister joined, not by reading, but by knowing. Their mouths formed words they did not understand. Their eyes remained open, staring at nothing. Their hands twitched in time with the beat. Outside, villagers gathered, drawn by the sound. Inside, the candles blew out. Ryder pushed through the crowd and burst into the nave. He found the singers standing in a semicircle, mouths open but still. The organ keys pressed and lifted without contact. The sound they made was rich, warm, and utterly wrong. A ninth voice joined. It came from beneath the floorboards. The ground quivered. A low moan trembled through the pews. Ryder dropped to his knees, whispering Vogel's name. That night, a pit opened beneath the altar. They called it a sinkhole, though no one ever found its bottom. The earth continued to hum. The choir no longer sang. They echoed. In sleep, in speech, in silence. Something had broken through. And in the pit, something stirred. At first, the townspeople wouldn't go near it. They stood in clusters just outside the nave, whispering behind cupped hands, crossing themselves as they peered through the broken doors. But by the second night, curiosity grew teeth. A handful of them entered. It was Ryder who descended first. He brought with him a coil of rope, a lantern, and a reel-to-reel recorder strapped across his chest. He descended alone, tethered by the waist, calling out every few meters. The pit widened as it deepened, stone giving way to something like packed clay, then something else, softer, porous, and warm to the touch. He recorded everything. His voice on tape grew strained, breathless. Around the 20-meter mark, the tone of the recorder began to distort. At 25 meters, Ryder stopped speaking entirely. There was only the sound of his breath. Then another breath layered over it, not his own. The rope went slack. Panic overtook the group above. They hoisted him up by force. Ryder came out shaking, covered in dust, eyes bloodshot. He had not screamed. He had not fought. But he whispered, over and over. The vertebrae are hollow. They carry the song. He never spoke in full sentences again. The church was barricaded. Police were called in from out of town, but found no cause for state intervention. They chalked it up to geological instability. They refused to listen to the tape. A week later, the dreams spread to those who had only stood outside the church. The dreams were always the same. A hallway of ribs, widening and narrowing with each breath. Hands reaching through mortar, fingers made of chalk. A woman whose face was both Lisel Braun and Clara Vogel, standing at the end of a bone staircase, humming a lullaby. Then, the missing began. First it was a couple from the outskirts, Gerhard and Anya Klein, sheep farmers. Their flock was found bunched tight near the tree line, bleeding in panic. The Klein's house was untouched. Their clothes still hung on the line. But their cellar door was wide open, and the radio in the kitchen was playing static. Then the grocer's daughter. Then a visiting plumber. Each disappearance was preceded by a sound. The villagers called it the canticle, a low, harmonic sighing that moved through the pipes, the floorboards, even the trees. Some likened it to a woman humming. Others swore it was more like chanting. But everyone agreed on one thing. Once you heard it, sleep became a trap. The mayor called in a geological survey team. They arrived with ground-penetrating radar, heat sensors, and smug expressions. They laughed at the stories. They rolled their eyes at Ryder, who now lived in the attic of the old rectory, scribbling symbols on the walls. But when their equipment descended into the pit, the laughing stopped. The data revealed an enormous cavity beneath the town, extending well beyond the church grounds. At the center of it, almost exactly beneath the altar, was a dome-like formation, symmetrical and unnaturally smooth. When the team tapped into it with sonar, it gave off a perfect F-sharp tone. The resonance shattered one of their monitors. They packed up and left that night. What they didn't know was that one of their assistants, an intern named Lenz, had stayed behind. Lenz was last seen entering the pit around midnight, a portable recorder in one hand and a flashlight in the other. He didn't return, but the recorder did. It was found on the church steps the next morning, wrapped in a child's cardigan. The tape inside ran for 43 minutes. Most of it was silence. Then came the music. Not a song. A pattern. 8 voices humming together, weaving over and under one another like strands of hair. The 9th voice, the discordant one, entered at minute 39. It sounded almost like speech, but backwards, layered, stretched. Amelia Krantz was brought in to listen. She locked herself in the rectory for 3 days. When she emerged, she held only a single page of transcribed text, written in the margins of one of Clara Vogel's old notebooks. It read, "Where marrow sings, silence rots. Below the root, the first voice waits. She is throatless and remembering." The tape was taken to Berlin. The next day, the river turned black. No cause was found. Fish floated belly up. Children screamed as their skin broke out in hives from even a touch of the water. The dam was closed, but it did nothing. The blackness seeped back upriver into the canals, the wells, and the gutters. It climbed the pipes like ivy. And then the pit began to smoke. Not fire, not steam. A pale, yellowish fog that drifted up from the darkness every dusk and settled on the pews. Anyone who breathed it reported the same thing. A voice in their ear, low and feminine, reciting names they had never heard. One woman claimed it was a list of the dead. Ryder insisted it was a choir roll. By now, most of the town had fled. Those who stayed boarded up windows and prayed. But the hum continued, even in dreams. Especially in dreams. The choir children, those who had sung that first hymn, began to speak in unison. They no longer answered to their names. They responded only to music. And Lissel Braun? She came back. Or rather, something wearing her face did. She was found standing at the edge of the pit, barefoot, humming softly to herself. Her eyes were black, her skin mottled in gray. In her arms, she held a book bound in some pale, scaly leather. The title was etched in bone. Cantus Osseum, the Song of Bones. When Ryder reached for it, she opened her mouth and sang. The stone floor cracked. The stained glass shattered. And deep beneath the church, something answered. The shattered glass hung like jagged tears across the nave, catching the pale light of dawn as it spilled through the broken windows. Inside the church, the air trembled with a silence that was no longer natural, thick and pregnant, as if the building itself waited for breath. The scent of wet stone and ancient dust mixed with something fouler, something metallic and deep beneath the surface. Ryder stood at the edge of the pit, the Cantus Osseum clutched tightly in his shaking hands. Lissel Braun's eyes, black and unreadable, stared past him, humming a melody that seemed older than time itself. Her voice wove through the fractured silence, rising and falling like the tides of some forgotten sea. The choir children gathered behind her, their faces pale, their mouths moving in perfect, unison harmony. Their song was not merely heard, it was felt, deep in the bones, inside the marrow, as if it called to some dormant thing buried in the earth beneath them. Ryder's heart pounded against his ribs. Every instinct screamed to flee, but something held him rooted in place. A terrible fascination, a compulsion to witness the culmination of all the horrors he'd uncovered. As Lissel sang, the pit began to pulse. The cracked stone floor groaned. Dust and tiny stones rattled down from the walls, and a low hum grew into a roar that filled the cavern beneath the church. From the depths rose a shape, vague and shifting, a mass of bone and shadow that seemed to breathe and stretch as if alive. Its form was crowned by a fractured skull, its hollow eye sockets glowing with an eerie, phosphorescent light. The entity answered the song. The church shook. The choir's voices soared higher, weaving around the monstrous shape as it rose, tendrils of bone reaching out, grasping toward the trembling congregation. The air grew colder, the breath of the earth itself stirring in the depths. Ryder dropped the Cantus Osseum. His hands trembled as he tried to steady his breathing. The ancient song, the choir, and this thing beneath, they were bound in a terrible symbiosis. The ritual was complete. Suddenly, Lissel's form twisted. Her singing broke into a scream that echoed through the cavern, shattering the fragile calm. The entity recoiled, and a blast of wind extinguished every candle. In that moment of darkness, the world changed.